Welcome, everybody, to the Culture of Life podcast. I'm here in Villianova again, with not with Professor Napier, but with Professor Georg Theiner.
That's right.
Okay, I'm sorry, doing the best I can with your name.
George will be fine.
Okay,
George.
George is a professor of philosophy here at Villanova University, and in specific philosophy of mind and cognitive
science.
Cognitive science. So we're going to get into some of that. We have some questions that we're going to go into about what that means and what it's about. And let's dive in. So, Professor, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you. So the first one would be, there's a lot. First of all, I guess the first question would be, what is philosophy of mind? How would you describe what that is to someone who's never heard that term?
I would say the core problem in the philosophy of mind is the relationship between mind and body in the person. We think about the person as the unity of mind and body, but sometimes we don't think very deeply about how exactly those two might be related. And philosophy of mind in the modern sense of the term, I would say really goes back to the way in which René Descartes, a modern day dualist, thought about this relationship. And he drew a very sharp distinction between the mental and the physical traits or properties of a human being. He actually thought that the mind and the body are two very distinct substances. And in principle, one could exist without the other. God could have created one without the other. The nature of the body is to be an extended thing, to be extended in space. The nature of the mind is to be a thinking thing. And if you can think, you're not extended, you're immaterial. And if you're material, you can't think.
Got it. Okay, so that's the philosophy
and
of mind.
And then the question is, well,
this.
If they're so distinct, how are they related? And this raises a lot of questions about how they interact. And some people have thought, well, this problem about how they interact is so hard that we need to actually understand this relationship a little bit differently. Maybe, in a way, we've underestimated what matter can be. Maybe matter is more potent and more creative than Descartes thought. It's not just dumb, inert mass. Maybe there is more creativity in matter. If you think about matter evolves in more and more complex forms, maybe in very, very sophisticated complex forms, matter could give rise to mental states. So they're not the same, but they're also not totally distinct. That's one way in which our understanding of matter has changed over the last few hundred years, and it has also changed the way we think about the mind-body relationship. Or at the same time, maybe spirit is really at the fundamental nature of reality. And matter is just a kind of manifestation of spirit, an extrinsic or relational manifestation of what's really at the heart of matter. And you could say matter is yet unawoken spirit. And that changes the mind-body problem again. That's the tradition that people now discuss under the heading of panpsychism. And the philosopher of mind really tries to understand the relationship between the mind and the body in human persons, but certainly also in other species.
Very interesting. That's kind of mind-blowing, actually. My first question would be, so if I understand that correctly, so Descartes had his famous dictum of cogito ergo sum, so I think, therefore I am. Basically, his personhood was associated from his perspective with his mind, with the fact that he thought, and that was his proof that he was a thing, let's say, right? Is that a good way to think about Descartes? Or at least that concept of his? Yeah,
he certainly thought there's something special about the way in which minds can know themselves. There's a kind of like immediacy, a kind of transparency to knowing ourselves from a first personal standpoint. And that is very distinct from the way in which we know our bodies, which is incomplete. You have to go to the doctor, and the doctor may well know better than you whether you have an injury and what exactly is the cause of the injury. But the way in which we know our minds, Descartes, is very special. And he thought that distinction in terms of how we know bodies and how we know our minds is sufficient enough to ground this understanding that mind and bodies are totally distinct substances. Now, mind you, this is by no means the only argument that Descartes gave for this radical dualism between mind and body, because as people pointed out to him, the very fact that you don't know yet the real nature of your body may be a matter of ignorance. It's something like people like to compare it with the analogy with Superman and Clark Kent, right? Lois Lane knows Superman in a very different guise as she does with
Right.
Clark Kent, right? But in the end of the day, it's one and the same person or substance, if you wish. We just know it very differently, and who knows? If you're going to do hundreds of years of more better understanding how the brain works, we may actually figure out that really in the end of the day, it's just one underlying substance that we may come to know in different ways. So that argument from the kind of like the privileged nature of self-knowledge to a more radical duality in nature, a real distinction, is a little bit quick. But of course, there's other arguments that Descartes and the rationalist tradition in general gave about that.
It's very interesting. This reminds me of a kind of Gnostic view, which is the material is that the real me is the spirit, let's say, and matter is fallen. And this is in contrast to, let's say, the Judeo-Christian view, which is that the Lord made the world good. Man fell away through sin and through self-will, let's say, of wanting to be like God by eating of the tree of good and not. And so, but the Gnostic view was, no, the world isn't redeemed. It's sort of, the matter is bad. It's not, and what is good is this spirit. And the way that works in the flesh is that, well, this flesh, I'm just this sort of meat puppet in a way, but really my spirit inside, my consciousness, this is the real me. To me, it sort of rings very similar to what Descartes was talking about. Am I right, or am I on the wrong?
I think
path
you're right.
there?
I think you're right. I think there is a certain. Some people say, in a way, Descartes was the first transhumanist, right? Because there is really nothing. The locus of value about what's relevant in being human is the soul. And the soul is immaterial. It just happens to be attached to a body, right? But in the end of the day, that is an expedient vessel. It does not have any intrinsic significance for the value of being.
This is the Gnostic
of being
view.
Well, it's also a view that, in a way, there's the rationalist view. There's Plato and Augustine and Descartes. There's a lot of, Augustine is a special. We'll get to this in a second, but there is a kind of direct line. And some of the arguments about "I think, therefore I am," you can find those in Augustine too.
Right.
He has a Platonist background,
right.
which of course he needs to then integrate with his Christian belief.
Right.
So what he does is, of course, he comes up with the notion of freedom of the will. Because if you think about the problem of evil, right, the Platonic way of explaining the presence of evil in the world is simply the recalcitrance of matter, right? Matter is imperfect because, in a way, the world, they didn't have the idea of the creation ex nihilo, right? The idea was that the Platonic forms are eternal, and the material world is created by the demiurgos, the kind of a craftsman who's not omnipotent, right? He is kind of, in a way, limited in his power, so he does his best to look at the forms, create the material world, but it's crooked and imperfect.
It's a pale instantiation of the world of forms.
That's right. So embodiment, in a way, embodiment is already the fall.
Right, it's a problem.
Because with embodiment, there comes a kind of, you forget what the soul already knew, ideally, so it kind of takes that away, and the question is how you can kind of get rid of these forgetfulness. And of course, that for Plato, education is the kind of like the kind of liberatory
you learn
path.
about the world of the form, the form of the good. You learn about the truth, things like this.
Exactly.
So
it's very different from the I think it's a very good. I'm glad you bring this up, because I think that's a very important starting place when we talk about transhumanism and the human form and humanity. That the Platonic and the Aristotelian model come from importantly different starting places. For the Platonic model, you're primarily a soul that happens to be embodied.
Right.
That means that in principle, that view is much more open to the idea that the body is kind of like an expendable vessel.
It's what's hurting you from seeing the truth, right? Because your senses, like he uses the example of the fish, right? Like, hey, you look at the fish, you try to grab it, but your senses are hurting you from seeing where the fish really is.
Descartes, right? Sensory knowledge, even the imagination, they're partly embodied, and that's part of the problem. For the Aristotelian traditions, right?
The hylomorphic.
The hylomorphic tradition, that's right. Hylomorphism being this kind of hylomorphe being form, hyle being the matter, is we're primarily ensouled animals, right? And that, in a way, on the
both
one
end.
That's right. It expresses both a kinship with the animal, because it's very important that we do have bodies, that we're not immaterial substances, right? But at the same time, there are certain faculties that we have, for example, the intellect or rationality, that make us rational animals and that distinguishes us from other creatures. So if you come from that tradition, from the hylomorphist tradition, then in a way, the ways in which the human form can be embodied is more narrowly constrained, right? That is a very, very important distinction. It is very...
Just put the mic a little closer. There you go.
Oh, okay.
Perfect. Sorry about
You're
that.
going to edit
Yeah,
this.
yeah.
Anyway, so just one thing that I've gotten interested in this, in the context of these debates, is also the discussions about angels, celestial intelligences, and how people thought about what it means to have an intellect of an angel. Because that's a kind of interest, and there is, of course, between the Aristotelian and the more Platonist tradition, there is a real distinction. For the Aristotelian tradition, Thomas is very important about this. Like he says, don't aspire to be an angel, because an angel is not a rational animal; it's an immaterial substance in the first place. So you cannot hope to emulate that intellect.
Right.
You will be kind of in
They're
a way,
immaterial and
you
you're
would
material.
dehumanize yourself.
Right.
But if you look at the Platonistic tradition, also in the Renaissance humanism, like Pico de Mirandola, right? Where he talks about this kind of like the education as a way of shedding kind of the sensory, the embodied form, and aspiring to be an angel, that would actually be in a way an elevation of the human condition, because he operates with this Platonic model where the mind and the body are kind of separate things.
Right. So he's a proto-transhumanist in a way,
That's
right?
right.
And
That's
he's
one
sort of
way.
saying like he's the proto of the guys saying, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to take your consciousness, George, and we're going to put it in this bottle up in the metaverse, and then you'll be free of death. You'll be free of the problems that Plato saw in your ability to perceive truth, because you're just a consciousness. We're going to extract the real you, the angelic you, maybe, and we're going to put that in this place up here, and good to go.
I think this is one version of transhumanism that is, I think, related to the Gnostic apocalyptic tradition, the Platonic tradition also, maybe also Platonistic Christianity, which has always been there. That's absolutely true. I think there's other forms of transhumanisms that really kind of that may be more in line with hylomorphism. So let me, before I
I'd love to hear that.
I think we can distinguish between three different, you want to call it, projects, about how all of them agree that there's something unique, something important about humanity, about what it means to be human. And we haven't really fully exhausted the potential of what that would be like. So there is kind of, there's an openness, there is some sense it's not yet completed, it could be improved in some sense. But those three projects disagree about what they take to be fundamental about humanity, and therefore about the vehicle by means of which this could be accomplished. You could call this, if you want to, if you like names, the avatar, the mutant, and the cyborg.
The avatar, the mutant, and the cyborg.
And the cyborg.
Okay.
Now, what are those three? It goes back in some sense to the distinction between Aristotle and Plato. But I'm going to have to introduce a third player here, and that is, I think the mind-body problem is really, there's a hidden third party. And this relates to what I'm doing in philosophy of mind, and that's the role of technology. The role technology has played for the human condition, for the evolution of humanity, anthropogenesis, how we got here in the first place, and where we might be going from here. Because I don't think there is any other creature. I think, to me, this is very important about being unique, that, where the ability to transform and change and modify the environment is something that has so significantly contributed to their psychology, to their sociality, to their economic conditions. That is really important. You think about technology. What is technology? They're tools for extending human abilities.
Yes.
All right? And it starts with very basic things. It starts with an axe, a knife, like the clothes, or a wheel. There is extend kind of manual or physical abilities. But think about the spectacles, right? It extends your sensory abilities. But I think that if you look at the evolution of human culture, I think there's a lot of cognitive technologies that we've used. Writing. I think literacy, writing, language, mathematics are some prime examples. External representational systems that we evolve and that we couple with our more biologically basic abilities. And it's only the combination of those that gives rise to certain types of cognitive abilities that kind of innate the naked brain, as some people say.
So they were nascent
would not
before
be
these technologies? Is that what you're saying?
I think it's right. I think it starts with very simple things like getting control of the fire.
Right, fire
so
was a big one,
you're
right.
able to cook
We
the
can
meat,
cook meat, right.
so you're able to get the more protein-rich diet, which means that you're going to have more energy to expand, which means you can develop these more costly, expansive brains, which means you're going to create more flexible environments, which means you need to, rather than have very kind of innate basic reflexes, you need to allow for a wider range of behavior. So there's a kind of co-evolution between the technologies we create, the skills and bodies that we have, and the brains that we have.
Right. Very interesting.
And that is, I think, important. That's in a way where nature and culture is kind of very hard to separate sometimes in the case of the human condition.
Yeah, I've heard this. They call it the expensive tissue hypothesis, where because our brains are so energy consumptive, they take so much energy, we had to give that energy up elsewhere. So, for example, our guts are different than other primate guts.
Right.
Because we had to have all this energy up here, so now we needed this super nutrient dense food. We can't sit around eating grass all day. We have to go get fat. We have to go get meat, protein in a certain way, so that we can get nutrient density per the energy, because we have this massive energy pull in our brain that we needed, that made us so, and then ultimately made us so different.
And we also have extended digestion. I mean, you can think about like the cutlery, right? Cutting the meat and the fire. You've kind of partly outsourced
your digestive
processes.
Right, exactly.
We kind of
We're
a little bit. I use this example. There's actually it's called extraoral digestion. There are some sort of creatures that
your smoothie.
Well,
you're masticating the food.
That's right. Yes. They, in a way, what they've done is their belostoma is kind of these giant water bugs, right? They sometimes they feast on prey that's much larger than them, right? It could be small turtles, could be fish, or they're hard to digest, right? For example, like a snail. Now, how on earth can you pull that off, right? Well, in a way, they use the prey as an external stomach. Rather than, they project their kind of enzymes into the prey, let it digest there, then kind of suck up the liquefied remains. And they can do this because they have a special kind of pump, a subaerial pump, that keeps them coupled to the prey. So they form a distributed digestive system. Digestion was a very hard nut to crack, I tell you, evolutionarily speaking. It's only it may be at the level of cognition, by the way. If you ever have a chance, check out the wiki on digestion. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, there's more.
So, there you go. If you look at this, we can, the way also in which once we were able to do this, our jaw morphology, our vocal tract was able to evolve in ways that later enabled the evolution of language.
Right.
And the fact that we have a prolonged childhood, right? That you're outside the womb, you're weaned, but you're not quite ready to enter as a fully competent adult. The world of adults. We have this prolonged period of childhood and adolescence that you don't find in other creatures. They're much more complete. Again, there's a third player, technology, that I think is important to understand the mind and body relationship. And this is where I now want to go back to our three paths of kind of trying to elevate or transform the human condition. Remember, we had the cyborg, the mutant, and the avatar. The cyborg is a shifter that goes back to, I'm sure our audience knows this famous article. The cyborg is a cybernetically enhanced organism.
Sure, like Terminator.
Yeah, I think in the context of second post Cold War, post Second World War, cybernetics was actually understanding the close interplay between the pylon and the fighter plane.
Right.
And the interface would be kind of the dashboard, and how do I design the dashboard in a way that kind of maximizes the synergy of the fighter and the plane? It has a kind of like a military context. But that's where the idea of something that's hybrid, it's half human, half technological, was born. And I think the more we're now starting to, technology becoming more ubiquitous, they're becoming more immersive, wearable technology, ingestible technology. But even if you're not actually wearing it all the time, the cell phone might as well be considered part of your extended mind, maybe. Right. I think there's a wonderful, Neil Harbisson.
Never heard of him.
The iBorg, the world's first cyborg. He is. I recommend you check this out online. He actually was born with an achromatopsia, so he cannot perceive color.
Okay.
And what he actually did is he has an implanted antenna in his head that is deeply integrated into his skull. And the antenna is sensitive to color, but transforms it into sound waves that are being propagated to his auditory system. So he has to come to literally hear color.
That's incredible.
Because distinct electromagnetic waves get transformed into distinct sound waves. And he actually, he's an artist, so he paints these kind of sound portraits of people. He would go close to you,
this is
look at your face, right?
Amazing.
And he's gonna check you out, and they say, oh, this is my George, or he has portraits of Martin Luther King and Hitler, and then he tries to let people guess who is who. It's on his TED Talk, and then the people can pick it out. It's kind of
incredible.
It's incredible.
I've never heard of this.
So here is a nice example how initially it's a kind of compensation because he's born with the deficit, right? So the technology helps him compensate. But of course, he realized quickly that I could, in a way, see more colors than the human can discriminate.
Right.
Right? So I could expand my repertoire of sensation and maybe, thereby expand the repertoire of what I can consciously experience.
Right.
And because there's actually a legal precedent, because he was at a demonstration in the UK and he was wearing this eyeborg, and the police thought he was filming the demonstration and kind of ripped it out. And that, arguably, he said, it really messed up, of course, his color vision and his perceptual apparatus. And he said, well, when you did this, you didn't really just damage my property. It's not just that the eyeborg is it's me. It's extended me. It was not property damage, but it was personal assault. There you go. There's a nice legal case. There's a few others where what counts as part of the person and what's kind of part of the world becomes fuzzy. And I think the cyborganization route is kind of, in a way, intensifying this kind of immersion of the human or the biological, the technological.
Do you see a difference, morally speaking, between the attempt to restore something that's a natural functioning of the body or this enhancement, where it's sort of like now we're going to make this new Apple implants where they're saying, okay, now you can just, I don't know what it is, I haven't used it, but you think of a song and it comes up. So you're not replacing, you're not saying, okay, I was blind, I couldn't see color in a particular way, and I'm going to use technology to restore the natural functioning of the human person, or that being one side, and then the other side being this enhancement, the super personification using technology. Do you see any distinction there morally?
I think it's a morally salient distinction to some extent, but it's very hard to draw, especially in the case of the human, because, as I said, the role of technology driving the evolution and development of human capacities. What exactly is the natural ability to do mathematics? You would, if you're good, you could subitize. You can say that's like 3ness, 4ness. We're pretty good at this.
Right.
The chimps are better than us. They can do this to 8 or 9. Human beings can't.
Right.
Right.
They beat us at chess.
That's right. We can use, of course, fingers. Right. We can count to 10, 12. That's about where it stops. Right. So you could not solve tensor equations. You could not do calculus unless there were hundreds of years of history of how human beings have sometimes systematically, sometimes by happenstance, evolved and developed more and more sophisticated notations, right? Including the number 0, including a symbol for infinity, that allowed us, in a way, to defy certain natural limitations of the human brain.
Is there a distinction there between internal and external, though? Is there a way like, okay, these are tools that we've created outside of us, and these other, now we're going to start to play with our internal mechanisms. We're going to start to implant stuff internally. Is there a distinction, or is there no distinction there morally in your view?
Yeah, I think the inner-outer distinction is not going to cut it. I don't think it's that important, because I think that that's one of the reasons why I'm personally skeptical that human brain interfaces are going to be really a dramatic improvement to what we can do today. Because if you think about it, all these implants have certain medical risks, right?
At least now.
They're invasive procedures.
Yep.
And so, I mean, think about it. The amount of information that I have access to through the internet and my computer, that's a massive game changer, right? But to get the information from the computer screen into my brain, we already have that interface. It's called perception.
Right.
perception is a wonderful, brilliant interface that has hundreds of millions of years of research and development that went into it.
Right.
That's not the bottleneck. The
Right.
bottleneck is, for example, is on the one side, the bandwidth problem outside, which we've in a way solved already.
Right. Thanks,
because it's
Elon.
very fast.
Yeah, right.
But the other is, of course, what we're going to do with all the information.
Right.
There's a cognitive bandwidth that we have, and right now we're in a way, just the fact that information is available doesn't mean it can meaningfully integrate it into our understanding and our reflection. I think this is the bottleneck. So in a way, what would the implant do? The implant would allow me to bypass the perceptual interface, but it would not necessarily help to incorporate meaningfully the information into my cognitive understanding. So I think that whether it's internal or external is not so
It's not the moral question. So is there a moral question? So for example, I think what you would probably, I mean, at least as I think of the way that the church might think through something like this, it would be the danger of the instrumentalization of the human, or as to think of you as a machine, to think of you as some kind of entity that is not a soul, let's say. Is there any distinction in your mind, or is this like, hey, that's some bunch of medieval scholastic nonsense? And
no, I think the notion of the soul is equally interesting to actually consider what it means to have a soul,
right.
as it is to consider what it means to have a mind, and it's subject to very different interpretations. And so it's partly it's depending on how you interpret the notion of the soul. I mean, whether you interpret it in a more hylomorphist or in a more dualist sense is going to make a difference.
It's confusing in that way because Aquinas has it as the soul is the form of the body.
That's right.
The body is the form
Right.
of the soul.
That's
right. Right. That's
The soul is the form of the body.
Right. Soul is
That's
sorry,
right.
The soul is the form of the body. So, which is kind of confusing. To think
That's
about.
right. Well, I think this makes. First of all, if you go one step more abstract, you can think about Plato and Aristotle of two different ways of thinking about form and matter. One's this form and matter are two distinct types of entities, and you get Plato's dualism. Others say those are two entangled
together, right?
types.
So then
Exactly.
you get the hylomorphism.
You get a hylomorphism.
The
Right.
matter and the form come together.
Right. But even if so let's, for example, think about hylomorphism for a second, right? I mean, hylomorphism is articulated within the larger metaphysical picture, a scale of being that categorizes and slices up the world in certain ways, right? I mean, if you go back to the Porphyrian trees, right, this is a very powerful and influential representation of the Aristotelian categories that Aristotle never drew these trees, but the diagrams come much later in late antiquity. But now think about like a very popular presentation of how this shakes out, okay? So you have the highest category, substances. You break this down into material versus immaterial substances. Among the material substances, you have living versus non-living. Among living, like for example, the metal, right? The mineral, right? And among the living, you have things that are sentient or not. That's for Aristotle was animals versus plants, right? And among the animals, you have rational and non-rational.
Right.
And that's basically as far as it goes, because at that point, you have arrived at the lowest species. Right? Then you have individuals like you and me, but we have the same essential property of being human because you're rational animals.
Right.
And notice how this category is constructed, right? It shows you something about the way Aristotle is defining terms or things, right? You have, say, being human, right? That's what you're trying to define, and you define it as a rational animal. Animal being the proximate genus, right?
Right.
And being rational is
species.
differentia specifica. That's exactly right. And what's important is that if you look at each of those levels, the distinction is mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive. So for example, look about living things. Either you're capable of sensing and moving, then you're an animal, or you're not, then you're a plant.
Right.
So there can't be any flesh-eating plants, right?
Right.
Right. And the very fact that actually plants might be able to perceive or have up to maybe 20 senses that are actually maybe based in the root of the plant is precluded because it's metaphysically impossible,
Right.
right? So when in the 18th century they discovered the Venus flytrap, it was caused quite an upset because why it would kind of upset the order of being if the Venus flytrap eats an animal because the animal is higher. These hierarchies have a certain value, right?
Right.
So people try to say, well, the animal doesn't really, maybe wants to be trapped, it wanted to be eaten, it didn't really, right? Now, think about this, okay? This is why I think thinking about plants, machines, non-human animals is important. It shows you something about how this hierarchy is constructed. Now, think about what I said earlier when we distinguish between living and non-living things, right?
Yeah.
The metal. The computer is a metal because it's made out of silicon. It's a mineral,
Yeah.
right? So there couldn't be a thinking computer because thinking is something that comes way down in the hierarchy. So you have to be an animal to think. So it precludes...
Sand can't think.
Sand can't think. A computer can't think either, right?
Right. Well, that's the silicon.
That's
Yeah,
right,
the chips. The silicon chips.
And you could also make the same argument about, for example, non-human animals wouldn't be rational, right? So if you discover certain types of rationality, right, that in a way, to some extent, it puts pressure on this received hierarchy. So I think that the whole question about animal ethics, machine ethics, even plants, I think it's an opportunity to think about hylomorphism, but to also kind of maybe reconsider what hylomorphism might mean today if I understand more about how rich and diverse nature actually is, right?
Right.
Because the whole hierarchy is you're still part of nature, right? It's not a Platonic idea that in a way you're completely split from animality or embodiment. But I think that what's possible and what's not possible, I think that's something that I think we may have to reconsider.
Interesting. So it's going to be an updating, sort of thinking through this hylomorphism, given the fact that there are these external things that can become internal given our technological advances, and they're going to fundamentally change our ability to do certain things that might call into question things that we had considered before kind of settled matters as it relates to this.
That's right. I have a paper. It's called Uniquely Human Without Exception. And the strategy of that paper was to argue, on the one hand, I think some of the discoveries we have made a certain kind of human exceptionalism, that human beings are really outside the realm of nature. I think that's kind of a gradually implausible view. I think that there's reason to think that humanity is in some sense rooted in the physical world. It has roots in the physical embodiment, in the ecology around it. That doesn't mean that it's not special or unique, right?
I think certainly morally, like other animals, we can't put dogs on trial, things like this. I mean, we have this sort of ability to decide, to view not the universal, not just act on instinct, but we can perceive universals. We can perceive and make decisions about how to manipulate, how to act given that. So that's different than other animals that we know of, at least, and plants.
Animals and machines, but I think it's once we look at certain more intelligent and seemingly autonomous machines,
right? And that's the question of AI, right? Is like, is it really thinking? Is it really discerning, or is it just a fancy parlor trick? At least at this point.
I think the question of AI, it puts pressure on this traditional porphyrin tree, right? But there is, in parallel to the Aristotelian hierarchy of hylomorphism, there is also an inherited legal distinction between persons and things, right? That goes back to Roman civil law, the Gaius and the Institutes, one of the most influential textbooks, where you can either be the subject of the law or you can be the object of the law. And it's defined in some sense by some sort of instrumental theory, right? You're either a person or you're an end in itself, or you're a thing, then you're a means to an end. And that is also a binary distinction, right? That I think as we now see certain, both animals and machines, we see them kind of in a way, we see certain cracks in this dichotomy. I think that...
That's one of these, is this internalization of technology, or even if it's external, if it gets sophisticated enough, it can enhance am I going the right way? That it can enhance us to such a degree that the machine almost looks like a part of us? Like it's a part of our consciousness? Is that your argument?
I think there's a distinction between whether the AI would be considered as a standalone entity that potentially might replace the human to perform certain tasks. That might be a problem too, because a lot of the jobs can be automated and can no longer be performed by human, or at least with the skillmen. On this hierarchy, there's also the more cyborgian possibility that AI is a more sophisticated form of cognitive extension, in the way in which certain writing systems, for example, are extended memory technologies or extended math technologies. AI extenders are cognitive machinery that itself involve a kind of artificial intelligence that could do a lot more than if you would not have that kind of AI component.
Got it.
And that, I think, especially, that raises certain questions about to what extent kind of in the moral domain, right? There's some interesting thought experiments that I've recently been discussing where to what extent these AI extenders might affect the moral status of the augmented human person. It's not a question about the machine thinking of itself, about a human person. I think I'll give you some examples. Think about, what does it mean to be a moral agent? There's a lot of definitions, but we can probably agree on 3 criteria or conditions that need to be satisfied. You need to be capable of making free choices.
Sure.
You need to be capable of deliberating about things in light of moral principles. You need to be sensitive to moral considerations. And you need to be motivated to act on the basis of such considerations. Right? And by and large, the competent adult human being is capable of these things.
Right, sure.
Right. Now, and this goes back to the therapy versus enhancement continuum. You could think about AI extenders that initially would be adopted as kind of like therapeutic purposes. For example, how could the first condition be violated? Somebody might, for example, have very, dissociative identity disorder, is incapable of making certain choices, is very drawn to has very bad impulse control, right? So you could have like a T-shirt, for example, that senses a certain state, maybe of your body, maybe of your brain. Whenever you're in danger of like giving in to certain impulses, it would kind of find a way of nudging you, reminding
Shocking you.
Well,
little jolt.
There are actually. I've heard that there are in some contexts actually they've tried this out in the.
Like a Clockwork Orange.
I asked my class, what if you would be supervised, and if you're not paying attention, like ideally, then you kind of get
a little shock.
you get a little right.
Right.
So in a way, and with the second, it could be, for example, it could be the case that it could be that somebody has like a problem with being motivated. Actually, they know what the right thing to do is, but they're not following through. Well, you could have maybe like a motivation pump, like an insulin pump, right? That in a way it compensates for a lack in willpower to follow. Right. So these are cases where you were.
It's interesting.
And I wonder what you think about this, right? Do these interventions of AI attenders make a difference to the morally?
It's interesting because what you're saying, okay, well, look, my pancreas, in the case of whatever the insulin, my pancreas is not producing insulin in the correct way, so I have this exogenous insulin that I have to put in order to augment a natural functioning that should be baseline for the healthy human person.
Right.
And what you're saying is, okay, what if you just took this same concept to the fully functioning adult, which would have an attention span of, we could measure it in a certain way, and if you're below that, then we could argue that, hey, look, we have, we're not going to violate any principles by just enhancing you to that level or giving you the help to get you up to a baseline of acceptable or agreed upon performance.
Right.
Let's say.
And once that's
not really an enhancement. It's
once I admit that it's possible for technology to get you back to that level, then the next question to ask is why do we have to stop there? Why
not go further?
Well, why do we give you in a way? This goes to the education technology continuum, right? I mean, to what extent would be an application of these technologies have the same effect as moral education?
Right.
Well, many people say it doesn't require the same effort. You could say, well, effort is not always necessary. Think about your health.
Right.
People said, you get vaccinated, right? You didn't say, well, you have to get infected to build your immune system first. No, sometimes we think a shortcut is all right.
Right, just give you a little bit of the juice. Give you a little bit of the virus.
And that's exactly right. And that's kind of an interesting question, right? To what extent would that kind of like lead to a kind of like, in what sense would it be actually a moral enhancement? Or there's, of course, a lot of dangers that you come in a way, you become passive, you become over-reliant on technology, you become de-skilled. But again, it's very tricky to draw a sharp line between what counts as therapy and what counts as enhancement.
There's these guys in Silicon Valley it's very popular, a lot of places, but in Silicon Valley they call it microdosing. So they just sort of take a little bit of LSD, like a little microdose every day. So they're not like out, sort of having massive hallucinations. They're just saying, look, in general, my emotional affect on a daily basis can be kind of negative as my baseline set. And I don't like that. I would like to be sort of a little bit up, a little bit, and more excited. So why don't I take a little bit of acid every day? Not enough that I can't function, not enough that I'm seeing fairies coming off the walls, but it gives me a little boost. And so I'm a little enhanced cognitively during the day. Why not be like in that state all the time?
Right.
In a similar case, it's like, what's the problem there? Like, why would it be?
Well, it's similar to coffee. Right? We do this all the time. Can you write a paper without coffee?
Coffee is great.
Once
coffee.
Coffee made it big. If you look at the history of when coffee was starting to spread through Europe, and there's a story, by the way, we were in Vienna, right? It actually it goes back to the Turks. They left behind the coffee beans, and then the Viennese figured out what the croissant, the half moon. That's exactly right. But once it was
outside of the city,
it was kind of spreading because it played a role in the kind of, in a way, enhancing or domesticating the workforce that had to perform.
Is there a distinction there though? Because coffee, you're altering your, let's say, your adrenal state, right? I don't know that it's the same thing as taking acid, which is actually a change of consciousness, or am I trying to find a distinction that doesn't exist? Like, because I'm taking acid, it's not like coffee pumps me up, gives me a little bit of adrenaline boost, maybe a little cortisol raise, my heartbeat goes up, certain things happen, but I don't know if I'm changing my consciousness in the same way as if you and I split a little microdose of acid, and now all of a sudden it's like, whoa, it's like everything's brighter and, sounds are more enhanced. And
I think
pleasure.
you're right.
Like it seems to be a distinction. I'm not sure if it's a morally significant distinction. My intuition tells me that it is, but I don't know that it is.
I think you're right. I think that there is a sense in which coffee or Ritalin or some of the nootropics, they're in a way taken to increase your attention. Right? Attention is a very domain general faculty. You can apply attention to all sorts of things, and it kind of increases quantitatively, right? And how sharply are you able to focus, for how long are you able to focus without getting distracted. But per se, it does not give you any new cognitive competencies. It does not give you any qualitatively new experiences. Whereas where you want to go with your question is a little bit like once the Iborg found out that I cannot just hear colors that the ordinary human being can see. I can actually now see colors that it would be otherwise impossible to see. Right? So in a way, then it becomes the question, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, the argument that people make in favor is a kind of argument for, well, we're unlocking certain regions of human phenomenology, of human experience that would otherwise not be available.
That's what the psychedelic
that's
people
and
offer.
in a way, and it's microdosing. We're doing it responsibly, right? We're not going crazy, but we do consider that. Just like, remember, your biological brain would not be able to do calculus, We're unlocking certain human potential, and here's where the transhumanist language comes out, right? We're giving you technology to unlock potential that we think per se is not a perversion of the human condition. Doing calculus is not a perversion, even though. Remember that there was a lot of resistance to the number 0. It was considered to be something.
I didn't know that, really.
Look at the history of when the number 0 was imported.
Was it in Arabic?
Arabic numerals. And the argument was what 0 is something that's kind of, in a way, almost like there's something evil about it because it's the absence of being. How can you calculate with that? And there was actually a debate between the algorists and the abacists. The abacists using the abacus to calculate, the algorists using the Arabic numerals to calculate.
Very interesting.
And there was a lot of skepticism.
Do you know around what time?
I think 13th century or something. There's
Very interesting.
And there was a lot of skepticism. There's the term actually 0 Schiffer has a kind of negative connotation originally in the West. It was 0 and infinity are the most interesting symbols because they're in a way we're cheating, but we're cheating very intelligently, right? And it doesn't have it's not very intuitive, right? Zero is not at all an intuitive thing. It's if you ask children who can already speak, right, but they can't write, okay, you ask them, write down or just come up with a notation for like a kangaroo. Okay, they're gonna draw something like looks like a kangaroo. They're gonna say draw 2 kangaroos. They're gonna use a kind of token iterative principle. They're gonna draw the same a second time, and then you say, well, what about there were no kangaroos? And then they're gonna say, I can't write that down because there's no kangaroos.
Right. So it's not in the world
So
of
it's
form.
not in
not
the
a form.
it's
Yeah,
not
in the world
intuitive
of
at all, right?
Right.
So the notation, in a way, this goes all the way from the number 0 to set theory in the 19th century, that people thought, oh my God, we're now introducing an infinite hierarchy of infinite sets.
Right. Same thing. So it's an
that is very
advancement
skeptical,
that
like
is
only God
dangerous.
is infinite. Well,
So the
the
argument-
rationalists thought about this in a way from this. They had these were
Right,
people
so
who were
the-
motivated by this idea that we could somehow, this could put us actually in closer touch with divinity.
That's scary, or that's dangerous to certain hierarchies within the church, or what
That's
have
right.
you. And
That's
so,
right.
So
That's right.
And so the argument then from our microdosing friends might be, well, look, we know that we only access a certain percentage of our brain's capacity, our conscious capacity. It was 5%, whatever
Right.
the number that's thrown around is. Why are we assuming that the other 95% is inherently bad? So if we're able to use this exogenous substance to access another piece of the brain or of our consciousness, like why not do it? Like the same way you're talking about, like zero unlocked a whole new aspect.
Right.
Although it's different, it's not as it took our same brain and accessed more of reality.
That's
in
right.
a certain way. So
That's
it didn't
right.
change our consciousness in a certain way, but we had access to this numeric realm, this immaterial
Right.
numeric realm in a new way that helped us also to manipulate the world in a certain way to our advantage.
That's right.
Building planes, trains, automobiles, things like this.
Wi-
But still there is this thing of, but if I take this thing inside and I'm lighting up new things, just turning that on. Is there? Why do I think that? Why am I like resisting this? It's just.
No, can I make one more analogy?
Sure.
Which sometimes about these debates about is that what is compatible with the human form,
Yeah, the
right?
human good.
the human good, right?
Yeah,
the
that's
human
the ultimate
condition.
question.
That's the ultimate question. That's right. The transhumanist gambit, if you wish, is to say, listen, there are certain pervasive and almost ubiquitous features of the human conditions that actually, in a way, may be transformable. They could, in principle, be modified because they remove certain limitations, right?
Yeah.
And I think that one thing that I always, when people ask these questions, is that what's humanly possible, whether it's good. It's very interesting to look at the history of like performance sports, right?
Right.
If you'd have asked
Steroids,
people,
right, yeah.
well, steroids are like a chemical intervention that has kind of, very detrimental effects to your health, right, to some extent.
Right.
But I think a better example is if you'd have asked people like 100 years ago, how high do you think human beings can jump?
Right,
Now
they would say
remember,
very low, or the 4-minute mile or whatever.
well,
Can
it
they
was
do a
before
4-minute?
1960, we didn't have the Fosbury flop.
Right.
People were using all
So
sorts
the
of
front,
straddling
yeah,
techniques
right.
or the scissor jump, right? And that was the frame of mind in which they took the question. How high can you jump with the straddling technique? If somebody said, but I can jump much higher with the Fosbury flop, because it's kind of like a neat way of modifying your bodies when you jump across that bar that lowers your point of gravity, right? So it's possible to actually, the center of gravity remains underneath the bar, but you jump across the bar.
Right.
Wow, right? All of a sudden, all bets are off.
Right, now you
right?
can go much higher.
Right, and this involves technology. It involves technology because it involves the foam.
A
Well,
technique.
the foam mattress, right?
Right.
Because without the foam mattress, you couldn't land that
Oh,
way.
okay.
That's
Okay.
true. But yeah, it's a technique. It's a kind of bodily self-modification that produced a totally new generation of athletes, right? They had to
Right.
be kind of lithe and like larger and not as bulky because they couldn't perform that, right? But in a way, well, who says that the Fosbury flop is any less conducive to bringing out the human form than the straddling technique?
Right.
And I think that what the transhumanists are trying to kind of, when they talk about this kind of unlocking human potential, is maybe we're kind of in a way settling too quickly on a traditional conception of what it would be to have the human form, or what the human condition should be like, and we take that as an absolute limitation, and we don't see that in principle it could actually be overcome.
Quite different, and if it's not a meaningful distinction that the novel technology is manipulating consciousness instead of changing your body to go over a fence, or like a whatever the pole vault thing is. The bar.
The bar.
Yeah, right. As opposed to taking an exogenous substance to change my state of the way I perceive the world. And I'm deciding that I want to enhance this in a certain way. I see it as deficient in a certain way, my baseline. And so I want to take this exogenous substance, and now I'm seeing colors more brightly, and I'm more creative. That's a human good. It's a human good to be creative, because I'm, even in a religious context, I'm imitating the creator, who is a creator. I'm a creator. He's a creator. Everybody's a creator. And with I take this extra little boost, I create a little bit better.
That's
so
right.
What's wrong? Where's the moral problem with it?
And I'm glad you bring up this analogy with the creator, because I think that this is also one important concept we haven't actually discussed, and that's the Imago Dei doctrine. Right? There's something about human beings being created in the image and likeness of God that is a distinctively human feature. Right? Yes, it's true that everything bears the mark of the creator, but they're not maybe having the image and likeness, whatever that exactly means, in the same way. And I mean, there's actually a lot of very different interpretations of that, obviously. But for the kind of early Christian philosophers, it was mostly a substantive interpretation in terms of what on earth could it be that makes us in some sense comparable or kin with the divine?
Mind.
Right, exactly. It's not like the biceps where you go to the gym and more often you're going to become more God.
Other primates have that.
That's right.
We have a particular kind of consciousness.
That's right. So it was of course either the intellect or the will. Right. And there is a difference actually in what you think is what's the divine signature trait of humanity. Right? Because if you think it's the Aristotelian tradition, the Thomistic tradition puts more emphasis on the end of the day on the intellect. Right? The intellect allows you to contemplate the created world, the order in the created world, which is already, it can't be, you don't need to do much to perfect it. It's already in a way perfect, but you got to in a way fit in, right? And understand the value of it and understand your place in it. So the intellect is it allows you to speculate.
Which is why Thomas might have a problem with this.
That's exactly right.
Because you're not fitting in. You're trying to sort of, you're Tower of Babbling this thing a little bit. Like you're going a little beyond. You've used your prudence wrong. You've made the wrong decision prudentially.
I think that's right. I think that if you are, this is why this is a very big deal. If you go like the debate between Aquinas and Scotus, if you go with Scotus, it kind of comes up with the very libertarian notion of freedom of the will. He thinks that the divine signature trait
the Franciscan line
versus the Dominican tradition.
So we started with we started with the distinction between the Augustinian and the Aristotelian / Aquinas, and now we're going to the Aquinas and Duns Scotus in the certain way, Franciscan versus the Dominican.
That's exactly right. I think those are two different projections of
one is the perception of God the Franciscan is more of this kind of the affective experience of the Lord and His love and the channeling of that in a certain way using the will, whereas the other is the using of the intellect to determine first of all to determine that God exists and is the best reason for why anything exists. God is existence and essence combined. And so it's an intellect, and the other is more of. Is that right?
That's right. I think a succinct way of putting it is if you put the emphasis on the intellect, then you kind of in a way think about the human as kind of in a way the top tiered creation, right?
Right.
And if you put the emphasis on the will, you're kind of like a low grade creator. But but it kind of puts the human. Because if you think that no other creature has that sort of freedom to create, then that puts humanity the real dividing line is then on the one hand you have God and the human, and then you have everything else,
right?
And on the other, it's more like you have the human and everything else, and then God is kind of really
Got it. And so
transcendent.
from the Duns Scotus side, the microdoser would be, hey, you are participating in creation in this certain way, and so like it might be an enhancement to your ability to perceive the Lord and to perceive the spiritual nature of reality, and your consciousness is enhanced in this way, and in a certain way it's a, as we would say as the Hebrews, Baruch Hashem, it's like, that's okay, God approves.
Well, for the rationalist tradition, right? The rationalist tradition, following the kind of the Scotus line, there is a sense in which knowledge is always a true knowledge that you can't acquire through the senses, but true knowledge that the Platonic forms become ideas in the mind of God, right? In the medieval world. So in a way, there's a sense in which if you are acquainted with the forms, and that's what knowledge is all about, not of particulars, but of universals, there's a sense in which you literally think yourself into the mind of God.
Right. So then in a certain way, the Platonic world of forms is the natural law, essentially, right? Or is there a connection?
Well, I wouldn't call it natural. This is why it's a
the universal
right,
law.
It's not the Aristotelian story, and also the kind of the Thomistic proofs about God, right? They're all in the way we would now call it inductive proofs or inference to the best explanation. They're all based on observing order in the created material world.
Right.
The ontological proof is not at all like that. It's a kind of like an a priori proof, right? That is you're conceiving something about God as the greatest conceivable being, and that would imply existence. It doesn't involve the natural world at all. It's not.
That's
inductive.
the ontological proof.
That's the ontological
so what
proof,
is it? How would you lay it out?
Which was
What's
skeptical. The Thomas, the ratio anselmi, right? It was actually it seemed a little bit presumptuous to the Thomas tradition that you can have such an understanding of like what's essential to God that allowed you to kind of bootstrap from essence to existence.
So in a certain way, if I'm understanding the ontological, what is the ontological proof? Maybe it's a better way to ask it.
The ontological proof of God, the way it was traditionally discussed, is a proof that starts from the grasping a certain feature of God, and that is the feature.
So his mind, the mind of God, in a certain way.
Our human mind, it's a very optimistic view about the powers of the human mind. To grasp a feature of God, namely that God is the greatest of all conceivable beings.
Right.
There is no being that is greater than God that we can conceive.
Therefore.
Right. And in a way, you then try to derive that part of what it means to be the greatest conceivable being is also you have to exist, because if you wouldn't exist, you
couldn't be the greatest.
It would be a defect of some sort.
Right.
That's right.
If existence, but don't you have to assume that existence is a good?
Well, you have to assume that existence is a great-making property, and that is a problem. That people have said that's.
I was going to say that's
you're
like
conflating being
you have some
round
depressed
being
nihilist
brown,
saying that what's so great about existence, like a Schopenhauer coming around saying, this is pretty bad.
There's
it's all torture.
There is also more interesting versions of the argument, namely that not existence but necessary existence is a great-making property, and that also Anselm came up with, and that is a somewhat more that's discussed to great extent, and that's considered to be a more viable proof. But I mean, first of all, notice that we're doing this a lot in mathematics, right? We are making a lot of indirect proofs about the non-existence of, for example, there cannot be a greatest natural number, right? Because such and such and such, we conceive of that,
right?
And then we make a claim about the non-existence. So it's not that crazy. We do sometimes move from conceptual considerations to questions about existence.
Right.
We don't usually with Bigfoot. We don't think that the question whether Bigfoot exists can be resolved by reflecting on
he's a being,
right? Because he's not the greatest conceivable being.
Right. He's just some friggin' monkey roaming around or not roaming around.
That's right. But the point and then this goes back to this debate about between Scotus versus Aquinas and the kind of rationalist versus empiricist. The idea that gaining these kind of insight into remember, the Platonic forms become ideas in the mind of God.
Okay.
Because in a way, the argument, to put this very succinctly, is that, right, if you consider the forms as mental properties of some sort, there needs to be a subject.
There needs to be a mind. There needs to be a mind.
There can only be a divine mind.
Right,
So
exactly.
that's where you get from the Platonic forms to a divine mind.
Right.
with these ideas.
Because how could they be anything else?
And that's right. And the argument would be, and you can see this like Malebranche and Leibniz, they're in a way self-consciously accepting this, that we kind of could literally, in a way, think ourselves in the mind of God. That is idea.
How do we, hold on, but that part is confusing. How do we get to that? Because we're able to also conceive, we're able to participate in this,
right.
and then therefore our participation in this greater mind presupposes that it exists in a certain way? Like, it would have to exist if we could conceive of it? Is that, or am I just confused?
Well, you are. I mean, first of all, go back to Plato. How do we know the Platonic forms?
Reason.
Right?
We have to think.
Well, that's right. But
We
the
have to get out of the cave. We have to get out of our senses and start to use our higher faculties to discern the forms.
That's right. So there's you can break this down into 3 steps if you will. So first you have this dualistic ontology. Like the forms are distinct from anything that exists physically that's tangible. The next question is a question about epistemology. How do we know it? Well, we know it because there has to be for Plato and to Platonists a kind of analogy between the knower and the known. Right. There couldn't be a tangible physical things knowing the immaterial soul. So the soul is immaterial. And in fact, in a way, originally it was in the same realm, but because it was embodied, it kind of, in a way, it fell. Right?
Got it.
And now it become like the impact of the body and the mind is somewhat debilitating. So we need the anamnesis, right? It's a kind of remembering the forms, getting rid of the distracting influences of the senses and the body.
Right. So it's
and
recognition, recognizing, recognition, rethinking.
Yes, that's exactly
right.
right.
Ratzinger talked about that.
Yeah.
Recognition.
That's
so
right.
we're rethinking what was already thought by the great mind. So our participation is a kind of remastication of the mind of God,
That's
essentially.
Right. That's
and
right.
so therefore, if we're doing that remastication, there must have been an initial masticator.
That's true. That's
right.
That's true.
Right.
I mean, in the Greek, and education is salvation. Right? It has a very salvation through knowledge. It's not divine grace. In that respect, the Christians had a very different idea about perfection and perfectibility.
This is the Protestant thing, right? Where they're saying salvation is, or it's. Oh no, I'm sorry, not Protestant, but sorry. Go ahead. I didn't mean to.
There are several. I mean, once you get into the early Christian philosophy, you had to synthesize certain sort of from the Jewish tradition,
from the Greek,
with the Greek philosophy tradition, and there's kind of the way in which, for example, Augustine thinks about. Because also that you get the problem of evil, then you get the notion of free will, then you get the notion of original sin, and that puts a damper on the idea that humans could, through their own means, bootstrap themselves to perfection. This is what the Pelagians
right? The Pelagian
that's
heresy, right?
That's right.
Like
the Pelagians are saying, well, it's not
we don't
so
need. We
bad.
didn't really. We can do it ourselves.
But
we
I
don't
think
need
that you
grace.
need to. I think it's very. This is what I think transhumanism is doing. I think transhumanism is a way of. I think the Augustine versus Pelagius controversy, as it plays out over many centuries, and the nature-nurture debate is, by the way, being one of them, is, I think, really important to understand the sensibilities.
How does Augustine relate to the Pelagian? Pelagius was saying, he's an English monk, right? He was saying something along the lines of, well, this falls not like we don't really like we can do it on our own. We don't need grace in order to. What was his view of the fall? The fall didn't really happen.
Well, no, but it was already in a way the redemption was already pretty complete with death and the resurrection of Jesus.
Okay, so the work was already done.
So the work is in a way been done. That stain has been removed.
This is also a Protestant. The
that's
Protestant
right.
view.
That's right.
It's like I don't have to do any work. If you suggest I need to do anything, it's like
that's right. That's right.
Jesus won the battle for me.
That's right. And Pelagius was also a very keen observer of the human psyche, as was Augustine, by the way. I mean, both of them were. But Pelagius, on his trip to Rome, observed when he kind of thought it was a kind of a moral laziness among some of the monks, because if they really you can really rely on on divine grace to turn everything around, right?
Right.
Even the most evil of human beings, then in a way he was worried that it leads to a kind of fatalism, an over-reliance on divine grace.
Right.
So in a way, the Pelagians
went the other way.
They were kind of, in a way, had a much more ambitious view about
self-help.
self-help. It's the kind of the self. That's right. That's exactly right.
Very American.
And in a way, in the 19th century, if you look at like Frederick Tennant and some of these people that were talking about original sin in this context, they were kind of interpreting this as a kind of evolutionary liability,
Got it.
right? That's with us, but it's not completely unavoidable. And you can think about education, technologies, various forms of like educational programs we devise as ways of kind of like gradually eradicating these evolutionary liabilities,
Right.
and therefore being more conducive.
And so how does this relate to Scotus? How does this go through him? How does this sort of Augustine to Pelagian? How does that go through Scotus and then get us to the non-problematic view of our microdosing?
The univocity of being. The key for the Scotus tradition is, and this was a debate between Aquinas and Scotus, when we talk about God, the language we use to talk about God, and we attribute to God things like mental features or like omnipotence or omniscience or mercifulness. It's a question about semantics originally, or are we using these terms, says all good or all powerful, in the same meaning? It's just that God has them to an infinite degree, and human beings have them to a finite degree, right? Or not. And
so we're a little less fallen on the Scotus view.
Yeah,
so we're okay.
So for the Scotus view, they're not the same meaning. They're also not equivocating, but it's only an analogy of being. So don't take these terms too literally, too seriously, because otherwise you're making category mistakes. Similar to, for example, Aquinas says, right? Yes, the angels have intelligence, but there's very different from yours because the angels are immaterial substances.
Yeah, right.
You're trying to emulate the wrong ideal. And this is a little bit how, don't take your language to talk about created things too seriously. It's not exactly the same meaning of the language we use to talk about God. But this code, and there were very clever semantic arguments both ways. Well, if it wouldn't the same meaning, how would we kind of ever be able to ground the meaning, and so forth. But the point is, if the Scotus, in a way, the Scotist univocity doctrine is the segue to modernity, because see, it puts in some sense the divine and the human on the same playing field. Right. Yes, one is infinite, the other is finite, but in principle, there could be degrees of participating in the divine or degrees of reducing the distance.
Right.
That's how Bonaventure thought about education. You're reducing the distance to the divine. It's something that the ideal of achievable perfection.
Got it. And Aquinas would bristle at that. He would say that's a little bit too egotistical, and we're just gonna like sort of figure out the divine order and find our way in it.
It's an expression of human pride.
Right, exactly.
You could say.
Right,
it's
exactly.
You're overstating the bounds of
and so
knowledge,
Aquinas would say
the
to
bounds of sensibility in an effort to elevate yourself.
Right. And so Aquinas might look at the microdosing guy and say, you've gone too far. You're okay. Even your arguments about you're participating in the creative act more closely to God, you're overstepping. You're instrumentalizing yourself. You're trying to turn yourself into a machine. You're therefore you're violating your end essentially, which is to be much more humble about what it is that that to use more of your given nature to glorify God, as opposed to trying to perfect your given nature to a imprudential degree. Was that?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of drawing kind of the boundaries.
And Scotus would say, "Don't worry."
That's right.
Like you're doing good.
Yeah,
like,
I think
I get it. I get where you're going.
Right.
I don't want to take the acid, but I get where you're going.
But I mean, going back to what the way holomorphism could be interpreted, and how exactly is the human form different from like the animal or the machine, right? Because that's partly is a contested issue. I mean, for example, right, what would Aquinas have said about Newton? I mean, right, before Newton, celestial mechanics and terrestrial mechanics are two very, very different things, right? The spheres move in perfectly harmonious, the planets move in perfectly harmonious spheres, and you can apply mathematics to that, but the earthly bodies move in different ways, and you really can't apply mathematics in the same way to them. So, in a way, coming from Galileo, the first one to apply geometry, like understanding it as a mathematical language, the book of nature being written in the language.
Right.
Math was not a language for the ancient Greeks. It was something that is not timeless, that is timeless. It refers to the way in which immaterial form exists.
Right.
Remember, you had to
The
study
Pythagoras
you
thing,
had
right?
to study geometry.
Right,
That's
So
right.
that a squared plus b squared
That's
equals c
right.
squared.
So in a way, you get from Galileo, Descartes, and Newton, but the point, right? In a way, and you had, by the way, the angels had the business of kind of moving them, right? So in a way, it puts them out of business in a way.
Right.
But so and or if you think about the distinction between like the natural and the moral sciences, right? You can't use mathematics to study the moral sciences. Well, there wouldn't be anything that we now consider as social, behavioral, cognitive sciences, because there's a lot of things that traditionally would fall under the humans. Like the moral sciences, then you can, to some extent, use mathematics to study it.
If it's a person, you can't kill it. If like a sort of mathematical formula. If we can determine that X is a human, if X equals human, you can't destroy it if it's innocent, for example.
Well, I think
it's a mathematical formula. It's a logical formula that you can create for morality in a certain way, the same way, and that exists exists as a feature of the universe in the same way that math does. That moral formulation.
Well, I think that generally speaking, just the fact that we can quantify or something, or at least certain aspects of human behavior, does not undermine the dignity of human beings in any way. I don't think that's that is dependent on it. The more I understand about humanity, how we live, how we think, how we grow up, how we are related to the environment, how we relate to each other, the more I learn, I find this marvelous and wonderful, and this keeps me going as a researcher. I want to learn more about it, so I understand about what makes humans special, and I don't want to mess that up. I think the category of personhood has done a wonderful job, actually, of providing kind of a legal device for preserving and the dignity of
You're
human
just
being.
not so sure if this technology is going to hurt it in a certain way, or
I also
essentially
think
the value of the human person.
Well, it's got to be certainly right.
Not necessarily going to hurt it.
Well, I certainly would hope that the legal frameworks will be redesigned in ways that protect what's important about personhood. I think that to put this philosophically, the extent is not so much the category of personhood. The category of personhood, I think, is not confined to the biological organism. Right. That is what I think. I think we need to
something else.
Think about possibly widen the extension of the category.
And so your question that interests you is, how does technology...
And I do think that, well, first of all, remember that the notion of personhood in the Christian tradition, going back through Poesius, it was developed to make sense of the Trinity, right?
Right.
And
how can he be one and three?
Well, they are not natural persons in the modern sense, right? Only with Linnaeus, where we get this notion of humans as Homo sapiens, we get a kind of modern Aristotelianism. Yeah, you're kind of in a way that there is a shared ancestry with hominins, but it's sapient, right?
Right.
And in a way, it gets tied to then this gets later interpreted. We had like Darwin, then we have the kind of genetic revolution, and now in a way, as if the notion of personhood is tied to having a human DNA. Right. Now, first of all, what does that mean anyway? Because, for example, we know about the microbiome in our guts, right?
Yeah, lots of other.
We are a community. You are a community,
of
right?
Mostly
There's a lot of
non-human
DNA, right? That, in a way, synergetically works together to create something we call a human person, a center of reflection, right? That kind of emerges from once you start drilling down, a very turbulent eddy of forces that are partly biological, partly cultural, partly social, ecological, technological. And so if I understand how
energetic, if you go down to the Einsteinian,
that's right.
Does it really matter at all?
So it does.
Is it just vibration?
Yeah, exactly. And the more I understand about it, I understand that there is. It's not just a purely kind of a legal construct with no basis in reality. I think that there is a basis in reality why we apply the legal category to natural organisms. I think that there is also. Personally, I'm very interested in collective agency, corporate agency. I think that we have devised collectives that, in a way, are agents in their own rights. I think they have some forms of collective intentionality. They have basic forms of building representations that tell us something about the world. There's corporate decision-making procedures that allow the corporation to make decisions that no individual would make, and so forth. I think that certain types of collectivities.
René Girard talks a lot about this, where this idea of like we're these groups of us find this, we just imitate each other to such a degree, this medic sort of thing, where we're just imitating groups, and so there's this kind of group identity with it.
I think it's not just imitation. I think in a lot of ways it's actually differentiation and division of labor that you then integrate, right? It's something that philosophers like to call joint intentionality or collective intentionality, which means that it's a kind of tool-level structure. You have an alignment of goals, but you also understand that we're going to have different parts to play in order to achieve that goal. And because of our different parts, we have different perspectives on the world. We're not eradicating those. We're not assimilating those, but we can kind of productively combine those in the pursuit of these joint goals. That's a very distinctively human feature, actually, by the way.
Right.
Which also means things like Michael Tomasello and other anthropologists have done a lot of studies comparing like chimps and human infants, right? And they always says like the chimps don't point and the chimps don't help.
Right.
Because to understand what helping is means to understand that we have a shared goal. You have a role. But the roles are in principle reversible. You cannot play your part, so I'm going to jump in.
They don't have a golden rule.
And I care about the fact that we do it jointly.
They don't care. Yeah.
Right. And I point to you, not because I want something, because I'm pointing it out to you, because I think that's, given our kind of common ground, it's something that you may be interested in.
Right.
So, again, this is something that I think that we've built on top of this kind of psychological infrastructure. We've built a lot of collectives that I think could be considered as agents in their own right. Whether they're persons is a separate story, but I think that we can actually learn. There's a lot of legal precedent how we deal with also the problems we have with dealing with some of the things like corporate agency, corporate guilt, corporate intent. I think that actually taking some of this and applying it to intelligent machines responsibly, I think that is an interesting way of how one might go about utilizing. I mean, the legal corporation is AI avant la lettre, right? It's you build in an artifice,
an LLC, right?
That's right.
Yeah, it's like a joint shared risk, and therefore it becomes a corporate body that you can almost give rights
and you shield the responsibility of the individuals, right? The limited liability corporation is a tool to expand human agency.
That's a huge
It's such a powerful tool that we almost cannot control it now. Think about the power of the right?
Yeah, the corporation's huge.
But there's a kind of like the idea of pedagogy, education, right? Something that we do, a Greek idea, right? Education would be not something that's biologically given, but it's something that in a way it refines us, it enculturates us, it brings out the highest of what we are capable of being.
Right.
The good, right? Then you have something like the medieval notion of like the persona, the artificial person. Like I think the corporation, and that is the modern institution, right? The modern state, the modern corporation. These are all kind of artifices that we construct to expand human agency.
Right.
And then later on you have the scientific revolution.
Right.
And engineering is another way of rearranging matter in ways that expands human agency. So that's kind of like it's all about transforming the human condition, right?
But there are ways and we should probably get going because I've taken up a lot of your time, so I really appreciate that. It's been super fascinating, and thank you so much. But there's a lot of interesting in political philosophy, these ideas of the distinction between these forms of government and then societies, from the church's idea of subsidiarity.
Yeah.
So what is the proper size? There is a level of abstraction beyond which there becomes a tyranny in a certain way, or it can be more easily ordered in a tyrannical way because it's abstract. I don't know that person in Washington, for example. They don't know me in the same way that if you and I had this local community here in Villianova, it would keep us in line in a certain way morally, and we're more involved in each other's life. And so at some level, to go back to the macro, there can be a degradation of human flourishing when it gets too abstract. So there is a way at which these technologies can serve, and then there's also a way in which they can get beyond. It can go to the Tower of Babel, and that's I think the interesting question.
Yeah. Well, I think that good. This is a great question. So I when I talked about joint intentionality, I had in mind kind of face-to-face encounters,
Right.
Small groups. We know each other, so I
Right.
kind of
Very
know what
different.
your values are,
Sure.
what your strengths are, and I can adjust. But of course, there is, once we move, the group size increases. I have the problem: how will I be able to tell whether you're potentially a good collaborator or not?
Right.
So you get into the problem from the kind of significant other to a generalized other,
Right. Yeah.
And this is
That's
where you
hard.
get from joint to collective intentionality, a kind of we group-mindedness, where you get the notion of culture comes in. Because what culture is kind of on an abstract level, is an alignment mechanism that allows you to make judgment about who's part of the in-group and who's part of the out-group, which in human beings, as we know, is very pronounced,
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
With agape being this kind of distant ideal that you push this to the limit, that everybody will be part of the in-group, right? But so in a way, the next step when you move from individual to collective intentionality is you get think about culture, about all the things that tell you these are like us in terms of your gestures, what you wear, your mannerisms, and like if you had it without any knowledge, anybody who's like me is a higher chance of being a collaborator with the one, right?
Right,
So there is a sense of I can trust them more because they're part of the
Right.
in-group.
Diversity is not our
Diversity
strength.
is not. That's right. But what I think has happened is that this relates to something in political philosophy about like the commons, right?
Right, sure.
To
The
what
common good.
extent are we able to regulate the commons, the common good, in a way that's not purely individualistic, because very often we know that individually rational people, like a tragedy of the commons, right?
Right, there's
Everybody
problems
adds
with that.
another
Right.
sheep to graze on the commons, and
Right, that's
reaps
the
all the
problem.
benefits,
Right.
but only
Doesn't
a
take the
fraction of the cost.
Right,
Now
that's the problem.
everybody's going to do that, and you run from individual irrational to collective ruins,
Right,
overgrazing.
Sure.
I think it's a very big problem. And how do you actually deal with this? Well, the kind of like the market solution is to privatize the externalities that are being
Right.
produced. The kind of more top-down government solution is regulate.
Right.
And Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for thinking about how can we actually regulate the commons in a way that does neither. It's neither top-down nor bottom-up, but it's a kind of like shared understanding that we know how important the commons is to us. We have certain shared governance principles. We know that somebody who violates those is going to be punished, and so forth. So I think subsidiarity or polycentric governance is something that I
That's
like to
interesting.
believe. That you're right. I think there is a danger that if these kind of collectivities becomes so
abstract,
large
yeah.
that it becomes entirely anonymous and you feel like a little cog in the machine,
Right,
as it
yeah,
were,
sure. It's a
then
danger.
I mean, there would also be exactly lacking is the sense of communal identity that allows the responsible people to actually
Right.
not overgraze and be responsible users of that commons.
Right.
And I think we need you need to install. There's going to be governance at multiple levels. And I think that it's very important not to kind of eradicate or get rid of the importance of local communities.
Yeah, that's true. There's an interesting Matthew Crawford who wrote this book, Shopcraft is Soulcraft. He's a philosopher, kind of a popularist, and he has this idea of attentional commons. So, for example, ability to create spaces where we're not inundated with advertising, for example.
Yes,
So, like, it's a resource.
that's right.
And he was sitting in went to the airport one day, and he's like, where all the rich people go in the airport, these private lounges, the one thing you notice is that it's quiet. Like, you don't have this cacophony. And they're probably the ones sitting in that place that are creating all of that cacophony of advertising outside with using technologies of various sorts to invade the common spaces.
That's right.
In order to sell stuff. And there's these guys over
That's a
at
nice idea. because
great.
it's a scarce resource,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And
exactly.
that's right. It
Attentional
needs to
commons.
be
Same way as
regulated.
water.
That's right.
Same
Yeah.
way. Very interesting.
Yeah.
He's very
No,
interesting. And the other guy, there's these guys over in Steubenville. They have a magazine called New Polity, and they're kind of thinking about a post-liberal political order, and they define tyranny as rule for personal gain. That's what it is. So if we live in a tyrannical, if
Right.
we're the opposite of that would be rule for the public good.
Yes.
And the opposite of that, to a tyrannical government or a tyrannical family, is people that are doing it for their own personal. And the problem, perhaps from their perspective, at least on the liberal side, and this might be a whole other podcast, but is that because the liberal, the interior, to go back to Descartes, this interiority, this initial interior move, eventually flowered into this kind of focus on the individual as the
That's right.
and whereas the Aristotelian was, no, you're a social animal. There is no abstracting the individual out and then creating this Hobbesian social contract.
Right.
That doesn't exist. It's like it's illogical. It doesn't accord with nature because you can't abstract it. There's no way to do this Rawlsian like veil of ignorance kind of thing. You can't do it.
Yeah.
So any philosophy politically that's built upon this atomized view of the individual is going to fail, and it's going to be tyrannical because you're going to end up destroying the natural subsidiarity levels, let's say, so family, local civic community, and all you're going to exist at the end is this tyrannical bureaucratic state, which is inhuman because it's meant to be inhuman. It's a technology that is designed to have replaceable humans as parts of it, right? Because the DMV, it doesn't matter, the guy there or the girl there could be replaced by somebody else. They're not really agents in a certain way. And what you're getting on the that's a problem ultimately because it's built on the wrong philosophy and because it doesn't and by the way, so all you're going to get is you're going to get the individual and then you're going to get a massive state apparatus, anonymous, essentially, and you're going to have destroyed all of the natural communities in between in order to pursue what John Stuart Mill might call experiments in living, individual experiments in living. And that's the problem for human flourishing. And that's where I think these questions of technology come into play, which is like, okay, technologies, governmental technologies, these technologies, what are they, I don't want to be Amish about it, but in a certain way, what they're doing, it makes sense. It's like, okay, new technology comes in. Okay, the telephone, for example, and our friends in Lancaster, they'll say, well, you can have it at work, but you can't have it at home, George. And the reason you can't have it at home is because you should go to your neighbors and talk to them. And so it breaks, our community is our value.
Yeah.
And the technology is then, we discern whether that technology is useful to build community or tear it down. Now, you could agree or disagree with their particular...
With the particular configuration.
But that's their theory, is that, no, we're not praying to these advances just because we can do fancy stuff and implant it in our brains or take it in our... Just because we can do it doesn't mean we should do it.
That's right. That is exactly right.
I think that's the important moral point to discern.
I am editing a volume on technologies for the future self and ethics for
Sounds great. Is there anywhere people can find
transhuman
this?
flourishing. So
Great.
I think that in a way, I do agree that a lot of the transhumanist rhetoric of overcoming limitations, unlocking potentials, is kind of libertarian or utilitarian in nature, right? It's kind of you're overcoming limitations for the sake of overcoming limitations, or for increasing your personal gains.
It's a Baconian
at
process
the expense
in a way,
of
right?
any.
Francis
That's
Bacon.
right.
It's like this. Nature is we're not a part of nature. We're here to destroy it for our good.
It's
basically.
a standing resource. It's a purely
It's
instrumentalist understanding of
the
anything
given
that's not
order,
a subject. That's
which
right.
goes back to the Gnostic view. It's like this is just nasty material that we can use because I think that's
and this is actually one. Maybe I want to finish with this because I think that sometimes I see people who critique the libertarian, utilitarian, individualist understanding of humanity and want to get rid of the notion of a person because they think that wrongly that the notion of a person is an individualistic concept. But that's certainly not the Christian understanding of personhood.
No.
It's a deeply relational concept.
right.
What's the human person if it's not rooted in the material world, in its material ecologies, social relations, right? So it's important not
and
to
the
kind
body of Christ, the mystical body of Christ. We're all participants in the same.
That's right.
Or we should be. I mean, ideally.
That's the we could talk about Teilhard especially there, but yeah, I think that some people in the we talked about machines don't quite fit into that thing versus person kind of thing, and then people say, well, the problem is because already you're kind of conceiving of personhood as a bundle of properties individual properties that you can either have or not have. And the more of these you have, the higher up you are in this hierarchy. And then at some point we're going to draw a boundary whether you're considered maybe a non-personal legal subject, maybe a kind of a half person, and that sort of thing. And that's kind of, people are skeptical and say let's blaming it on the notion of the person. The notion of personhood is already like the wrong binary way to look at this.
Right.
It's kind of already an expression of human individualism and exceptionalism.
Right, sure.
And I think that what we said earlier about the emergence of the person that is deeply rooted in these ecological, social
the imago Dei.
dimensions. The Imago Dei has a relational interpretation too.
Right.
After all, if you think that there's something to the notion of the Trinity, the persons exist only in community.
Right, exactly. That's a great point.
And if you create it in
That's
the image
great.
and likeness of something that's a community,
Then
how could you then
just be
flourish or
inanimate,
thrive if you're
without
not
that.
in community?
Amen.
We sometimes think not too deeply about, we think that the interpretation of the Imago Dei is all about the mind or consciousness and the intellect. It's not. It's about relationality, at least as much.
Well, Professor, thank you so much. I hope I'd love to do a part 2 if you'd be open to it at some point in the future. We'll rest and sort of think through. But thank you so much. Is there anywhere where you would point people who are listening to check out your work? Do you have a website? Should they go to your website on Villianova, or is there anywhere we could?
I think most of the work is available at the website academia.edu.
Okay. They just look up
which
your name
you
there?
need to. Yes, if you Google me, you will find this.
Okay.
But you need to be a member of academia.edu. You need to sign up for the website.
Does it cost money, or is it just?
No,
okay,
it does not.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor. I really appreciated the time. Dankeschön.
Thank you. Danke. Schönen Tag.